we have, we will be dwelling on, if you see that already on your screen, geography, history, and archaeology of the Bible. Oftentimes we don't pay attention to this, but they are actually somehow helping us in uh, appreciating the text of the scripture, because they sometimes provide us with some evidences that we need to actually make us feel assured that the things that is told in the Bible has really happened. So when you basically know the place, which is geography, and then the history about that place, and then the results of the researches and studies of archaeologists, then you'll be able to more or less confirm that indeed a certain group of people existed there, and that event that is being described in one of the books of the Bible, it indeed happened in history and so on. So they are helpful. So it's good to be able to at least look at them individually, so that you'll be able to know that these different sciences are able to actually help us deepen our appreciation of the text itself. So before we go on, I think it would be good for us to have more or less an idea what these different words would mean and what they basically pertain to. So the first thing that we have to look at is that when we talk about the Bible, we refer to as biblical context the places like ancient Near East, Mediterranean Basin, and Palestine. So these are terms that we will be able to get to know. In many of, at least in the Philippines, and I don't know in Vietnam and in other countries, some we don't usually are, at least we in the East, Asians, for example, are not very keen on using maps. When we give directions, we just point with our finger or with our mouth or whatever it is that we can make use of to point to that place. But we are not very familiar. We are not so used to using maps to find directions here and there. Of course, today more and more we are using it. But I think it would be good for us to have an idea of the places that we're talking about, especially in the Bible. Like in the map that we have there, although it's not very clear, but at least it gives you an idea that this is generally the place where most of the stories that you find in the text of the Bible happen. So that's basically ancient Near East. When you're talking about ancient Near East, we're talking about basically these places here. So we're talking about a place like Palestine in this area, and then of course you have the Asia Minor, which is partly or majority Turkey, country of Turkey today. And then of course, basically when you go to the right of it, you'll be able to see basically the places like Babylon, Assyria, and Persia, and so on. But today this would be like Iraq and Iran. So you'll be familiar with these places. And of course, the other many states that are already located within the Palestine area. And below it, basically, you'll find Egypt. This is the continent of Africa. So you'll find Egypt and the other places in Africa that are mentioned. And then if you go left, upper left, you'll basically from Asia Minor, you go to Greece. That's Greece. And then the next one beside it is already Italy. So this is the Mediterranean Sea on your left side. So this is basically what is referred to. So when we say ancient Near East, we're talking about this whole place, this whole place from Palestine, Asia Minor, then Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and so on. And then the Mediterranean Basin are basically the places around Mediterranean and around the Mediterranean Sea. So it appears like it's like a basin, so it is referred to as that. And of course, the main place that is at the heart of the story is basically located in this side, where you find the place called Palestine. So when you talk about the Bible, that's generally the context, the place where everything happened. So that's why it's good for us to be familiar with these places. Because nowadays, when you look at the map, a modern map today, you may not be able to recognize some of these places because the names have already changed in time. But more or less, you will see that these are the same places that mostly occupied by Muslims today are basically the original context for the many stories that we have in the text in the Bible that we have today. So let look at the these three different terms that we have here, like geography. So geography basically deals with the study of maps, topography, topography meaning the terrain, whether it's a hill or mountainous, or it's a valley and so on, or it's just flat. And so that is part of topography. So when you study the terrain of a particular land, you basically study the topo. Then you have the climate in these places. So that's included in the study of the geography. So I cannot emphasize enough how important is this, so that when you read the text and you are familiar with the places and you know the topography and the climate of the place, they can actually enrich your appreciation of the text. So because you know what happens, so you have an idea of what it's like to be in that place. Like for example, when we talk about the missionary activity of Saint Paul, and most of the time he would either go by foot or take boats because there are so many islands in the places. So, but if you know these different places that Paul went to, you'll be able to appreciate the fact that his missionary work was indeed really very tough and very difficult, and in fact very dangerous. So you'll be able to appreciate the fact that he has made a lot of sacrifices just to be able to respond to the invitation of the Lord for him to be his missionary, to be his apostle, especially in the what we call this, in the Gentile area outside of Palestine. When you talk about the history, you talk about events, people, events, and what happened. So you have an idea about it. And of course, you realize also that when you talk about history, we have to be very critical about who's telling the story, because sometimes the story is dependent the on the interest and the biases and the objectives of the writer as well. So we have to be very aware of it as well. And then archaeology has something to do with the material culture. Do you have any idea of what an archaeologist would do? So they would usually go to some places that is old, and then they excavate, they dig and excavate things, and they would be able to find some fossils, some remains, some artifacts, and so on. So these are gathered and they are studied, and they're basically reconstructed to be able to tell us the history behind a particular place, for example. So if they dig into the land, they will be able to see actually levels of history in the soil in the land in itself. When you go to Greece, for example, when they created these subways, the metro, in many of the excavation, they were still able to find some fossils, some remnants, some artifacts while they're doing that. And they have actually preserved some of those. That's why when it's underground, you'll be able, it's almost like, it's a train station, but it's almost like going into a museum, because you'll be able to see that there is a wall of soil that is preserved, and in that soil a lot of materials are jutting out, like saucers, pots, and ceramics, and so on, that you will see. So these are the materials that they study to determine the history behind that location. And sometimes because of this study, they will be able to prove that indeed the story that we have in the Bible have actually basis in the history. Of course, the telling of the story is not always as exact as it happened, but at least we know that if they talk about an event that had happened in that place, you have these archaeological materials to actually prove that that existed here and there. So generally, these are what we call this independent science in our study, but they complement and they really help us in the study of the text. And it really is a good help in terms of confirming whether a particular story is historically reliable or historically true, and so on. So it will be determined. What is common among these three basically is they basically address they talk about the land. You know that in the Old Testament the land is very symbolic because that was basically what was promised to Abraham, and eventually that they were journeying in their life, in the life of the history of the people. They were basically going in that journey to be able to reach that land that has been promised to them. So geography basically talks about the maps, the topography, and the climate of the land, history, things that had happened within that land. And archaeology basically is looking into the physical soil and land itself to be able to learn about the culture and the history of these places. So that's generally what we are able to study from out of these places. Now, some terminologies before we continue, so that we are on the same page with regards to the terms, especially regarding the places and the people, especially then and how they are called today. We will only mention some of the most important ones. So we begin with the what I mentioned earlier as the ancient Near East. Today, you will not be able to see any map that will contain that name. But when they talk about the ancient Near East, they're referring to places like Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is actually a place, if you remember, I pointed to you the place where it is now Iraq, that whole place. So that's where Mesopotamia is. And that place is called Mesopotamia because it is in between two important rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates or Euphrates, those two rivers. That's the reason why it's called Mesopotamia. The word is a Greek word which actually means something in the middle of two rivers. Meso is middle. Potamia is from Potamos, which means what we call this river. That's why hippopotamus is actually uh, a river horse. So that's generally what that means. So just by the name itself, you already know where to locate it. It's that place in between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. Then it also includes Egypt down below, where I pointed to you at the northern tip of the African continent. You'll find Egypt there. And of course, Israel of the ancient world in the Palestine area. So those are generally the places that are referred to as ancient deities. The kingdom of
Terminology.
Assyria, which you have heard when you read the Old Testament, was located in the northern part of Mesopotamia. So Babylonia would be in the south. So Babylonia is important because you know that it part of the history of even before the exile. You know that the Abraham comes from a place close to that area, and we will see basically later on as we show you the map. Then the next one is Mediterranean Basin. I already pointed it out. All of the places, the lands that surround the Mediterranean Sea. So these are Asia, the continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe. So this is the location where the Greco-Roman cultures thrived during the ancient times in antiquity. So that's why when you hear about the Greco-Roman culture, these are some of the places that has been affected by it or have been influenced by this particular culture. Then the next one is the Roman Empire. So you know that the Palestine during Jesus' time was under the Roman Empire at the time, and many places in that region, in that location. So, but when we talk about the Roman Empire, we're referring to the military, political, and legislative entity that was basically an offshoot of the older one, Roman Republic, which was governed by an oligarchy, by a few, like the Senate. And this Roman Empire began with the establishment of the first Emperor Octavian in the year 27 BCE, before the Common Era, or before Christ, if you want to use that. So 27 BCE. That's the beginning of the Roman Empire. Another place is Asia Minor. Of course, it is Asia, but it is not exactly the Asia that we know today. So it is the peninsula, roughly equivalent to modern Turkey now, that has as its northern border the Black Sea, or the western side the Aegean Sea. This is between Asia Minor and Greece, and to the south you have the Mediterranean Sea. So when you see in the letters of Paul or in some parts of the Old Testament mentioning about the Asia Minor, it is that place above Palestine, which mainly majority of it is part of the country Turkey today. So, but some portions of it are not part of it. But that's Asia Minor. In that Asia Minor, you are familiar with places like Ephesus, like Laodicea, Thyatira, so Philadelphia. So those places, Phrygia. So those are places that are found in the Asia Minor. Even what do you call this? The city of Troy of the Greek story of mythology. The city of Troy is located in Asia Minor. So in that place. But anyway, if you try to discover and read more on these places, you'll be able to know more about the history of the world, at least even just by going through these places. Of course, the Palestine is most important in our discussion because most of the things that happen in the Bible happened within the Palestine. Now, when you talk about the Palestine of the ancient times, it's a huge place. So it's from the Mediterranean Sea in the east, I mean in the west, to the Jordan Valley in the east, and from Galilee in the north to the Negev in the south. The name is actually a derivative from the Hebrew word for land of the Philistines. So that means Palestine is actually originally what is called the land of the Philistines, and it dates back to the 5th century BC. So that's the Palestine of yesterday, especially in the ancient times. But the whole topography and the whole geography of this place has been changing as we come nearer to the time of Jesus. And up to today, practically that whole Palestine is divided into so many different states already. They are no longer just one place. So you have, for example, Lebanon in the northeast, and then on the other side you have Syria, and then if you go and below that you have Israel, below that you have Palestine, and then to the east you'll be able to see the state of Jordan and so on. So it has become several places already, the Palestine of the ancient times. The next one is Israel, the promised land of the Hebrew Bible, and the name refers in biblical texts both to a geographical region, that means a place, which changes in terms of its profile and composition. And also it refers to the nation or to the people residing there. So there could be so many meaning to Israel. So that's why you have to be accurate when what are you referring to when you use the word Israel. Then the Hebrews. So Hebrews are usually the term that is used to identify our ancestors, the ancestors of the Israelite nation, beginning with Abraham and Sarah to the time of Moses when they were in captivity in Egypt. So they were always referred to Hebrew people or Hebrews on account of the fact that they were speaking this language. So eventually that name was changed into Israel or Israelites, especially when they started to establish the kingdoms of Israel. So the people of God from then on, from the time of Moses when they got out of Egypt and in their journey towards the promised land and the establishment of the kingdom of Israel in Palestine, that's when the people of God were referred to as Israelites. Okay, we're still talking about the same people or maybe a later generation of the same people, but they are now referred to as Israelites in this particular context. And then, of course, the third one is the Jews, the descendants of Israelites after the exile. So the name is derived again from the Hebrew term for Judeans. because when they came back to Palestine after the exile, they only stayed in the southern part of Palestine at that time. If you will see later on, the kingdom of Israel was one at the beginning, and then it was divided into two, and then the southern part was the one that was last surviving place until it was taken over by the Babylonians, and eventually people were brought as captives to Babylon and other places here. So these three names that you find here basically are names that you can use to identify the people of God. But you just have to be politically correct when you talk about history, that the Hebrews as a term for the people of God was only used during the time of Abraham to the time of Moses. And then the word Israelites were used to identify the same people, especially from the time of Moses to the time that they were exiled to Babylon. That was basically more almost a thousand years, thousands of years. And then the Jews, of course, as we mentioned, are the descendants of the same group of people, but they were basically a group identified as such after the exile. So they were called Jews, and as mentioned, the term has something to do with the fact that when they went back to Palestine, they occupied Judea, that portion of Israel, of the big Israel before. So that's why they were called Judeans, and eventually, on account of their religion, they were called Jews, because the religion was eventually called Judaism in these places. Now, word of caution with these terms. Today, when you refer to the people that are occupying now the present Israel, don't call them Israelites, because they are not Israelites anymore. The proper term to use for these modern occupants of Israel are Israelis. And then, of course, neighbors to them, and actually their relatives, still their relatives, are the Palestinians. So they are still basically in a situation of conflict politically, because both groups are claiming ownership to the same lands here and there. So these are the modern name used to these people living within the region of ancient Palestine today. So just that's why be careful to identify them. So don't use the word Israelites to identify them today, even if they live in Israel, because that's no longer the term used for them today. So they are Israelis in the present time. Okay, then let's go to the biblical world. This is generally a copy of a map that was depicting how the world was in the earlier times. And if you notice, there are only a few places identified. So here in the place you could see, of course, the body of waters would be in the blue color. You have the Mediterranean Sea on the left side of your screen, Black Sea on top of it, and then we have the Caspian Sea here near the area where Russia is, and then you have the Persian Gulf below there. That's where Iran is, and then of course the Gulf War happened in this area. And then of course here in below on the left side where Egypt is, you have the Red Sea in that place. So, but if you can look at the places, so here in the middle where there is a little bit of a haze there. So you find Jerusalem, Damascus, Tyre, and Tyre is part of Lebanon today, and so on. Then Tarsus is on top. It's in the Asia Minor area. Then to the left you have Ephesus and Sardis. Then you have Athens here, Greek. And then this is generally, as we mentioned, this is generally Egypt. Then Damascus is there, Nineveh is there. So we mentioned that this Nineveh is part of the what you call the Assyrian kingdom before, and this is generally in the olden times was called Mesopotamia. These are the two rivers that basically enclose the place. You have the Euphrates and the Tigris. So this was where Mesopotamia was. And then, of course, if you go down a little bit, you'll find some of the places that have been identified, like Babylon. And if you notice here, you have Ur. If you know the place Ur, uh, does anyone know what the place Ur is? Who is who is identified with this place?
Abraham's
Abraham.
father, Abraham left.
So Abraham was actually from this particular place, and then they went up there in the north, and then you'll see the place of Haran in this area. And then of course the rest basically would be history. So this was basically how the map at the time looked like. There were not so many places identified there, and it's understandable since there were so little people then at the time. But when the people were growing in terms of population, of course, many places have been discovered and established and so on. That's why if you look at the later map, it will definitely be filled up with so many names here, like what we see here. This one here is a map that is a little bit later, and you'll notice that the many places have already been identified. It's still similar to the map that we were looking at a while ago, but this time there are more places that are identified. Like if you look at the place below Egypt, there are many places that have been identified already. And then you have Libya to the left of that. And then Arabia is now is this place, big place where Palestine is. And then of course you have Syria there. And then below that, of course, you have Babylon. You will be able to see Babylon here, then Syria there. This Persia here is the present day Iran. So things like that. And then of course the Asia Minor up there. And then but the names that you find here are basically reflective of the times. So at this point we will talk about Palestine because practically this is at the heart of the biblical world. So this is what we're looking at, this whole area here, the Palestine. And of course, you are familiar with the place because during the New Testament times, that's where Jesus came into, where he did his ministry and so on. So it actually also helped them with these places. So let's just familiarize ourselves more or less with these different places. But before we continue with that, you might want to see this other map. It's a little bit bigger. So this is the Palestine area here on this left side. This Great Sea here is the Mediterranean. And then, of course, the Asia Minor is identified still as part of the Hittites. So these are the different tribes and groups that are identified with these different places. This actually is Abraham's journey. So we mentioned earlier, to your right, the city of Ur there. This is actually near Babylon. So that's where Abraham came from. So when he was called, he was asked to go, and then they actually stopped here in Haran. Then, of course, for the journey of Abraham, the red one, it continued on until they were able to actually reach Shechem, for example, and then go down to Egypt. So like that. But of course, that's generally, and then there are other what we call this journey of like Jacob's flight with the yellow color, and then of course Eliezer brings Rebecca to Isaac. You see the color green there. So, but these are the areas at the time, especially during the time of Abraham and the succeeding time. This was how the map of this place looked like. So you can still see them. But of course, the New Testament times, this whole this whole Palestine area would look different from what it is today. So anyway, what we're going to look at is generally the geography and the topography, especially of these places here, the area of Palestine, because that is, as I mentioned, where most of the stories that we have in the Bible is actually located. So that's the context. So here is an Old Testament map of Palestine. If you can still look at it, also the Great Sea is still the Mediterranean Sea, and the names that are in white fonts are actually the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is how they divided the whole promised land. And you can see that story in the book of Joshua, where they started dividing these places. You have Asher here, you have Naphtali, Zebulun, Issachar, Manasseh, Ephraim, Benjamin, Dan, Judah, Simeon, Reuben, and then Gad. So these are basically how they partition the places. And then the names of the places that are here, some are still familiar with us, but some of the names that are here are no longer existing, like Kedesh, and then you have Beth Shan, Shamir, Saphon, Pirathon. Shiloh is a little bit mentioned still in the story during this time. Adam, Yaser, Gilgal. So this is the Red Sea here, and on above it is that river there is what is called the Jordan River. So again, in the New Testament times, this will be well known in relation to the activities of John the Baptist, where he would do the baptism, and also Jesus eventually asked John the Baptist to baptize him in this river. So it comes from in the north part, that is part of the Galilee that we will know in the New Testament, but that basically brings water down to the Jordan Valley to be able to go to the Dead Sea. You already know the idea why is this place called Dead Sea, right? So the salinity in this place is very high. That means salt is really very high. That people, when they go there, you will hardly drown in this place. You'll always float. That's why people, when they go there, they can just wade through the water. The reason why it's called Dead Sea, because this body of water, it only receives water from the north through the Jordan, but the water that are found here no longer is distributed somewhere else. So it doesn't goes out of it. So it is stuck there. So that's why it's not healthy for a body of water that it only receives and then doesn't is not able to give water eventually in the end. But anyway, that is how the Old Testament Palestine looked like at that time. So the present day, the Palestine that we're talking about, particularly in the New Testament, would look like more or less like this. So it's actually divided into 5 geographical regions, including the desert that are there. Beginning with the coastal plain, then the central hills, and then the Jordan Valley, the Jordan Plateau, and then the desert. So just by the names alone, you have plain, you have hills, you have valley, you have plateau, you have a desert. So you already have an idea of the topography of the place. Some places will be just about right. The others would be a little bit elevated because of hills. The others are basically deep down because they are valleys and so on. And then plateau generally are like flat places and so on. Then of course the desert area where no one is able to survive on the right side. So let's look at these different places one by one and see the significance of these places basically for us. So the first one is the coastal plains. So if you notice the yellow arrow there, that is basically what the coastal plain is all about. So it runs basically from here, Gaza. Are you familiar with Gaza? This is a place that is always in trouble because of the relationship between Israel and Palestine today. But anyway, that's basically from that place up to Tyre and Sidon. Yung Tyre is part already of Lebanon today. So this is basically the stretch of the coastal plain. So what is significant about this place is that it includes an ancient international highway called Via Maris. It's not the restaurant that we have, Via Marion, Via Mare. This one is Via Maris, Latin for Way of the Sea. It extends from Egypt down it there and then through Palestine along the Mediterranean Sea, all the way around the Fertile Crescent to Mesopotamia. Are you familiar with the Fertile Crescent? It's actually the place where Palestine is, going up there and then turning around, going to the area of Assyria and then Babylon. There, it's called Fertile Crescent because these are the places that are habitable, where people can plant. Some people are farmers even in these areas. So it's called basically a Fertile Crescent. It's like an arch going to Mesopotamia area. In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 1, you will see that this particular highway that we're talking about, that Via Maris is mentioned there. It says there in the text from NRSV, he will make glorious the way of the sea. So that coastal plain extends 125 miles from Gaza in the south to Lebanon in the north. So more or less, if you know how to convert that to kilometers, so you'll have more or less an idea of the stretch of the coastal plain. Now, the Philistines, the enemies of the Israelites, were located in the southern part of the coastal plain area. And we saw that earlier, the Negev place. It's a semi-desert region. It's at the southern border of the place in itself. So that's generally the coastal plain. And so even the names of the highway is familiar. So Negev is here below, if you notice. That's Negev. So this whole place is called Palestine because it has been known to be the land of the Philistines. Here you will see plain of Philistia. So it has been identified there. But they became the arch enemy of the Israelites. Then the places here were taken over by the Israelites at a later time. Okay, the next region that is important is what is called the Central Hills. So even just by looking at the map, there are already protrusions. So it's protruding. So it's not a flat place. So there are hills. So it's up and down. So the whole area where Jesus had his ministry was like this. It's generally basically what we call this hilly. That's why if you try to listen to the story that they were walking from Galilee to Jerusalem, you can just imagine the walk that they have to do. It was not a flat terrain. They were going probably up and down and rough and so on. So you can appreciate the efforts that they have to do to be able to go to one place to the other. So Galilee is in the north, and then down here you have Judah, and of course Jerusalem is in this area. So you will see that later. So what is the significance of these places? So probably the most important geographic region, because as I've said, many of the stories that we have in the Bible, in the New Testament as well as in the Old, would mention about so many of these places located in this area. So it is located to the east of the coastal plain and runs about 180 miles from Galilee in the north to Sinai in the south, where you find Mount Sinai. So it would include highlands, I mean, lands that are on top of hills and so on, like Baguio City, probably in here in the Philippines. The only thing that I can say about Vietnam is probably the Dalat area. It looks like a place is very mountainous and hilly. It's closest to what we have in our place in Baguio. So anyway, that is Galilee in the north and then Sinai in the south. And then the highlands would be Judea, Samaria, Galilee. And then of course, there are also valleys and plains. Yung not only like protruding portion of land, but also lands that are basically lower than the usual. Now, the place of Galilee, in the north, is subdivided into lower and upper Galilee. And mind you, the difference in terms of elevation is approximately 1,000 feet. So it's not just a very small hill. It's really a very high difference with the lower and upper Galilee. So locations that you find in the lower Galilee are often mentioned in the Gospels, like Nazareth, Capernaum, Cana. They're in the lower Galilee. After the Second Jewish Revolt in 132 to 135 CE, the Common Era, the areas of both Upper and Lower Galilee were important for both the Jews as well as for early Christians eventually at a later time. Now, about 20 miles west of the northernmost tip of the Dead Sea is the city of Jerusalem, in which the temple was located. That's why if you want to locate the Jerusalem in the map, just look at the the Dead Sea, and then on the northernmost tip of the sea, you go to in the direction of the westward, you'll be able to see the city of Jerusalem that is located there. You see, so that the central hills are, I think, the most important place, especially during the time of Jesus, because many of the things have happened, at least in this location. Okay, the next one that we have is the Jordan Valley. So if we have hills and mountains, then we have something that is what do you call this? Uh, uh, Very, very low and very deep. That whole section where we find the Jordan River as well as the Dead Sea. So this is also a very important place. So east from the central hills is a depression. So it's a depression of a land that runs for about 260 miles between Dan in the north and Elath in the south. So between the Lake Hule, now that lake is now drained, and the Dead Sea, the Jordan River flows along the Rift Valley. So the Jordan River basically is what connects this lake in Galilee and the Dead Sea, basically, which is at the bottom. Now, in the Dead Sea area, that is where you find the lowest place on Earth. It's 1,300 feet below sea level. Some of the places in the world are below sea level, but this is actually the lowest that it can get, 1,300 feet below sea level. It's where the point where the Jordan River ends at the Dead Sea, where the Jordan River and the Dead Sea meet. That's the lowest place on earth. That's why if you happen to visit, for example, the Holy Land, don't miss going to that place so that you can actually brag about it and say, I have been at the lowest place on earth, 1,300 feet below sea level. Then you have John the Baptist ministry, as mentioned in Matthew and some other Gospels, and baptism and forgiveness. They took place in and around the Jordan River in Judea. That's why if you're familiar again with the place, as you read the story of John the Baptist and his disciples and so on, they were actually frequenting these places that are a depression that is very, very, very deep. So when they have to go back to Jerusalem, they have to go up, and the whole travel would not actually be that easy for him and for the people that are there. So you can just appreciate the efforts that they have to do to be able to propagate their belief at that time. So after the Jordan Valley, we have now the Jordan Plateau. So of course that's the place beside it. So, and of course in this area, part of this place here, especially in the lower part, you will see that it is now part of the state of Jordan. And then, of course, up there, it will be part of the Damascus that we know, Syria that we know today, Syria. Anyway, that's these places. But let's look at what is significant there. If in the coastal plain you have an international highway called Via Maris, here in this section you also have a highway, another highway. So this whole area of the plateau is to the east of the Jordan River, is a level plateau that runs north to south from Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, to the Aqaba Gulf down there. There is another, as I mentioned, another major international route known as the King's Highway. So it passes through this place. If you go to the book of Numbers, number 2017, so that's the beauty when you have the Bible with you, because while listening, you can actually go through that. So if there are mention about passages like this, if you look at the book of Numbers, chapter 20, verse 17, you will see there being mentioned the King's Highway in a message from Moses to the king of Edom. Sometimes in some translation, it's called Royal Highway. So it's not, but anyway, these are related. So this has been highways and routes that has been identified early on already and was already famous, because these are the main routes or routes that people would pass through if they go from one place to the other. By the way, when we say international highway, do not think about it in the same way that we have highways today, because I don't think the highways that are referred to here are big or wide highways. No, for as long as maybe a chariot or a carriage can pass through it, then that's already a highway for them at that time. It's just that it was the main route for people to travel within the area. In Joshua, the book of Joshua, chapter 13, verse 8, you will find the story about Joshua's division of the land as when they partitioned the land according to the 12 tribes of Israel. The land east of the Jordan River, sometimes called Transjordan, would feature in this tribal division. It is also mentioned as part of the partition places that are mentioned here. Okay, so that's the plateau of the Jordan. Then the last one here on this side is you find basically the desert. So of course the desert is a very large place and hardly people would be able to survive when they cross here. So that's why when people would go to Egypt, for example, from the other side, like from Babylon or from Assyria, they will have to go up there and then travel down to be able to go to Egypt. It would have been easier if they could just cross the desert, but unfortunately, it was a very difficult terrain. You will not be able to survive. You'll be lucky if you'll be alive after crossing the desert at that time. It was very dangerous. But at the same time, it was something that was good also for Palestine and the places here because it became basically a fort, something that will protect you at least from this side. You only have to mind the coming of people from this side here. But here you have a formidable fort where people cannot just cross, and if they do, they will not be able to survive. So that's the desert. So it's the most easterly region of the Syrian desert, which borders on the plateau of Jordan and reaches the north towards Syria, as well as eastward into the present-day Saudi Arabia. Now, so this basically complete the shape of the Fertile Crescent. By the way, the crescent is a crescent moon. The It's not the half moon, but a moon that looks like an arch. So from the side of Babylon to the side of Assyria, and then of course going down to Palestine and Egypt. So this forms basically the crescent. So in the middle of the crescent, you will find basically the desert. So that's why this desert shapes the Fertile Crescent. And again, as I mentioned, provides a natural barrier since it was not suitable for traders or armies to traverse. Otherwise, they will really be killed. They will not be able to survive it. So if this is the desert, so this is the crescent from Egypt down here, going up there, and then to the side of Assyria, Nineveh, then Babylon or Ur here. So that's basically what is referred to in world history as the Fertile Crescent. Okay, so of course, aside from these different places, maybe we'll just continue with the discussion because as I think it's almost time. So anyway, we still have another class tomorrow to continue at least with this part. So we're practically finished with geography, just a few more things, and then we will go to the history around these places that we're talking about. So we'll just look at that at a later time. Anyway,